Welcome, my name is Avery Peck, and here I'll be breaking down and recreating what I consider to be the look of Stranger Things. We'll start with an outside shot that has that soft retro feel. Then we'll be moving on to a nice dark interior shot that kind of matches the look of Mike's basement. So go ahead and grab your camera, let's get started. So I'm going to start off with the daylight look because I think this is probably the easier of the two. Now there are three elements that we really want to pay attention to here: dynamic range, color palette, and separation. Let's address dynamic range first. Both seasons of the show were shot on red cameras, and to really do the look justice, we need to maximize the dynamic range coming from our camera. If you're on a DSLR, you can start by turning your in-camera contrast all the way down, or you can use a flat picture profile like Log or CineStyle if you have that. I'll be shooting this on the Blackmagic Cinema camera, so I'm going to be shooting everything in RAW, which is the best option if you have it. The second thing you can do is set your camera to its native ISO. Now mine is 800, but it's different for every single camera, so you'll have to Google it for your specific camera model. Much of the show's look also comes from its color palette, which is dominated by browns and teals, with red being a go-to accent color. Now in this shot, I'm wearing this vintage denim jacket, which is bringing in some blues and a little bit of cream in the collar. And underneath that, I have this button-up plaid shirt that's bringing in some browns and a little bit of red. So that matches the color palette quite nicely. Now I'm also trying to include these colors in the background. You can see the way that I frame the shot, I'm including a little bit of sky, so I have those blues coming in, and then I have the corner of my house over on the left side that's bringing in some browns. So let's move on to the actual cinematography. I'm shooting this on a 50mm prime lens at f2.8 so I can get a nice shallow depth of field. And to control my exposure, I have a 7-stop ND filter in my matte box. Now I'm using all natural daylight to light this, and I'll just be using some silks and bounce boards to control my light a little bit. Now you notice I'm putting the sun directly behind me, and this is to create separation from the background. The first thing I notice straight away is the backlight is way too intense. So I'm gonna set up a silk on my C-stand to kind of diffuse that sunlight a little bit and bring the levels down. Now that backlight is still present, but it doesn't look too harsh. The last thing that I want to do is bring some light in on my face, and I'm going to do that using another silk as a bounce board. Now typically you bring your bounce boards in from below, but in this case I'm actually going to try to emulate skylight with my bounce board. You also notice that I'm putting it directly in front of my face, so I'm basically flat front lighting my face. And you can see right away the effect that that's having. There's a big difference before and after that bounce. So setting up this shot really is that simple. Now it's time to move on to the color grading. Okay, we're here in DaVinci Resolve, and the very first step with our shot is to color correct it. So I'll start by turning my saturation down to 0. So we're just looking at a grayscale image, and I'm gonna use the curves here along with the parade to balance the luminance of my image first. So I'll grab my black point and drag this down to where the bottom of my image is resting here right on the bottom of the scopes. Now it looks like my midtones are too dark, so I'll grab the middle of this curve and bring it up. And finally, I'll grab the top of this curve and bring my highlights right up near the top of the scopes. And there we go. That looks very nice. At this point, I can begin bringing some color back into the shot. I'll take my saturation up to 100, and we can also come to the RGB mixer page and turn up the red, green, and blue output bars, which is another great way of adding some saturation. Now we have a noticeable green color cast to this image, so I'll hit Alt-S to add a new node, and I'll come over here to my primary bars and turn the luminance mix down to 0, so each bar can act independently of one another. And I'll begin to bring some green out of the midtones using the green bar under the gamma. There we go. I can also maybe bring some green out of the highlights. And there we go. Now we have a balanced image. Here's the before and here's the after. It looks much better. I can also bring in just a little bit more color. And that looks about right. Now we can start to create that Stranger Things look. I'm gonna hit Alt-S and Alt-P to add a parallel node. And we're gonna use a couple of parallel nodes to help create the color palette of this shot. So in this first node, I'm going to qualify this skin. So I'll come to my qualifier tab, grab the eyedropper tool, and select my skin tones here. Then I'll grab the feather tool and just drag this around a little bit to help blend my selection. Perfect. Now at this point, I'm also going to grab a power window and just constrain this right to my face so we can see on our vector scope exactly where our skin tones are falling. Now you want to make sure that this show skin tone indicator is checked, so you have this line, and we want to make sure that our skin falls right on this line. So I'll come over to the log wheels and I'm going to push some of that orange color into the midtones. Okay, again, keeping a close eye on the vector scope. And if I want to, I can hit Shift H and even shut off our power window briefly, just so we can see what the skin looks like with the rest of the shot. And that's looking about right. I can adjust the low and the high range. If we want to, we can push a little bit of red into the shadows and also drop the shadows down slightly. This will just add some richness and some life to the skin. And then finally, I'm gonna actually push my highlights towards a nice warm golden color. Actually, in this case, I'm pushing it more towards red. That looks good. So here's before that correction and after it. You can see we're just adding a little bit of extra color and life into the skin. The last thing I can do is come over to the midtone detail and turn this down a little bit, and that will just help smooth out any imperfections in the skin. Now in this next node, I'm going to address all of the teal and cyan colors. So I'll once again come over to my qualifier, and I'm actually going to just do this manually. I'll increase my softness, decrease my width a little bit, and then I'll just swing this over so we're selecting our cyan tones and our blues. Now if we compare this to an actual still from the show, you can see that the browns and the teals are directly complementary of each other. They have about the same saturation and they fall along this very orderly line. So coming back to our image, you can see that first of all, our blues are not quite saturated enough, and they fall within kind of a broad spectrum here. So I'm going to use the hue versus hue curve, click on the cyan and the blue dot down here, and I'm going to drag this blue dot up a little bit and drag the cyan dot down, and you can see that that's actually sort of concentrating our hues so that they fall along a single line. I can also bring in some more saturation so that they're about as saturated as the show. So if I come back to the main shot, now we have those cyan tones really coming through. The last thing I can do is hit Alt P again. That will add a third parallel node. And in this node, I'm going to suppress our green tones. So once again, head to the qualifier and we'll select our greens here. And we want to take the saturation of our greens down quite a bit. So I'll pull some saturation out of the greens. And then I'm also going to come over to the primaries and I'm going to cool these greens off a little bit. So I'll use the gamma to push some blue, some kind of teal blue. I can even use the gain. So we're trying to help these green tones kind of blend with the blue tones of the shot. And there we go, that looks a lot nicer. Now my skin is looking a little bit desaturated, so I can maybe bring a little bit of color back into my skin, and that's looking really nice. The last thing I'm going to do is add an overall red color shift to this image. So I'll hit Alt S and then hit Alt L to set up a layer node. Now the reason I'm doing it this way is because I don't want our skin tones to be affected by the red correction. The skin tones are correct where they are, and I want to keep them that way. In this bottom node right here, I want to select my skin, and what we can do is take the node where we've already qualified the skin, and we can connect these two little triangular tabs here. And this is basically like an alpha channel connection. So if we look at the alpha channel of this node right here, you can see it's currently the opposite of our skin. So if I come over to the key tab and click the invert button, you can see now we're back to our original skin selection. So this node has our regular normal skin tones, and it's being layered on top of the other node where we'll be doing our red shift adjustment. So we can basically adjust how much we want to bring back our normal skid tones versus how much we want them to be affected by the grade. So I'll come over here to the other node and begin to add my red shift. I'll grab my gamma and begin to push this a little bit towards some reddish hues. You don't want to go too overboard with this. This correction is also washing out some of our blues. So I'll come back to our blue node and just increase the saturation slightly to compensate. Now we can come over here to the skin pass-through node and we can adjust the gain. So if we turn the gain down to 0, then the skin will be affected entirely by our red shift, and you can see that looks very incorrect. So we can kind of find a balance here. Right about there looks correct. So 0.55, I'll just round that off. Perfect. Now if we compare this to a reference still from the show, we can see that if we look at the skin tones and some of the brown areas, we're actually getting a lot of very similar colors out of this shot. All right, obviously there are some slight differences because they are very different shots. Okay, obviously I'm dealing with a lot of greens in this shot, which really changes the look of the grade overall. Versus here, obviously, they're not dealing with greens at all. But overall, I'm very happy with this look. With the daylight look finished, now let's move on to the interior look. So I have my camera set up with the same 50mm prime lens at f2.8. The very first thing I'm going to do is bring in my key light. In my case, I'm using an inexpensive CFL bulb that's shooting through an umbrella. I'm basically doing a Rembrandt style lighting setup with this, with the camera pointed slightly towards the shadow side of my face. So it still looks like it's front lit, but it's also nice and dark and moody. Now, one thing that we do need to take care of is all of the spill on the background. I'm gonna bring in a black solid on a C-stand and basically put that in front of my light source to knock that spill off the back wall. Now we're getting a really nice isolation between me and the background. Now it's time to light our background. For this, I'm using some tungsten balanced practical light sources, basically just two regular desk lamps with tungsten bulbs in them. And on the right side, you'll notice that I'm using one of the light sources to illuminate the wall behind the shadow side of my head. So we have the black shadow of my head against an illuminated wall, and we have some natural separation there. On the other side, you'll notice that I'm leaving the background black next to the illuminated side of my face. So again, we have the bright side of my face against a black background, and we have some good separation. The last thing I can do is bring in just a little bit of fill for the shadow side of my face. The thing about Stranger Things is it does a great job of striking a balance between being shadowy and being sort of evenly lit. It's kind of interesting. They front light faces a lot, and they usually use a lot of fill, but at the same time, they make sure to have some deep shadows on the face. So I'm really happy with how the shot is looking in camera. Now let's move on to the color grade. Okay, here we have our second shot, and thankfully, in my opinion, this one is a much easier color grade than the first shot. So let's start off by balancing our image. I'll pull the saturation out of the image and use the curves to balance the luminance. So I'll drag my black point down to where the image is just touching the bottom. Then I'll grab my white point and bring this up until that practical light is right there at our white point. And I like the exposure of my face, so I think I'm just gonna leave that as is. Now we'll begin to bring some color back into the shot. So I'll take this up to 50, go to my RGB mixer, and boost the red, green, and blue, like that. And that's looking good. So let's add another node and take care of the color cast problem, because we do have a noticeable green color cast. So I'll come down here and I'll just use the tint parameter right here. I'll drag this to the right, and that kind of takes that green out of there. There we go. And then I'll maybe mess with my color temperature a little bit. I'll cool this off slightly. I'm just using my shirt and my skin kind of as a reference here. And that looks about right. So there's before and there's after. We've just taken that green tint out. Now we are ready to start grading. And the bulk of this grade really just comes down to controlling the light coming from our practicals and controlling the overall color palette, which in this case is much easier because we really only have one dominant color. So I'll hit Alt-C, which will add a new node with a circular power window. And I'm going to select this practical over here on the left-hand side. There we go. And if you look at some references from the actual show, you can see that their practicals are very yellow, where in our shot, you can see those practicals are orange. They're almost red. So to fix that, I'll go to the primary wheels and push my gamma kind of towards yellow-green. Something like that looks about right. And if I want to, I can even push a little bit of that same color into the gain, so I can just color my highlights a little bit. It's kind of a little trick that you can use to disguise clipped highlights. So that looks good. Now I'm going to do the same thing with this backlight over here. So add a new node, go to our power windows, and I'll use a gradient for this. And just kind of get this in place. And I'll make the same exact correction. Push this gamma over and just make this kind of yellow. Nice, so that's looking good. Now the color of our practicals, I think, definitely matches the color from the show much better. Now we can do a skin tone pass because my skin is looking a little bit flat. So I'll add a new node, come over to my qualifier, and just like normal, grab my eyedropper, select my skin here, and then blend my selection. Excellent, and I'll come over to my vector scope and just make sure that our skin is right there along our skin tone line. So I'll isolate it with the power window. It looks good there. I'll come over to my log wheels and just start pushing that color into the midtones. So I can come back, I'll shut the power window off and come back to the main composite view. And so I'll push that color into the midtones, and then I'll play with the high and low range to kind of get that color where I want it. There we go. We can also push some color into the highlights as well. I'll push kind of a nice yellow gold color. Then maybe I'll bring just a touch of saturation back into the skin. So we're just adding a little bit of extra color and life back into the skin. Now we only have 2 more nodes to go. Now I'm going to do a final luminance pass here. So I'll take my saturation back down to 0, come over here to the parade, and I'm actually going to bring the middle of this curve down a little bit to where the highlights on my skin are right around 384 on the scopes. I want to leave my practical nice and bright as kind of a visual anchor point, kind of a reference for the eye, and that's looking good. So I'll bring my color back in. Cool, that's looking good. The skin looks a little bit too red, so I'll come back to my skin node and just fix that real quick. I'll maybe cool off the highlights a little bit. There we go, that's looking much better. Excellent. Now the very last thing I'm going to do is make some of these yellows look a little bit more brown. And the way to do that is just to pull some saturation out of those yellows. So I'll come over here to the hue versus saturation curve, click on the yellow dot here, and just pull this down a little bit. And as you can see, that just desaturates the yellow tones of my image and gives it kind of that faded vintage brown look. Now if we compare the vector scope of this final image to the ones from the show, you can see that they're actually pretty close. So here's the vector scope for this shot, and for our shot. It does look like our shot could be just slightly more saturated. So bring the saturation up just a tad. Looking very nice. And that's the end of the second look. Now, if you enjoyed this episode and you have a suggestion for what I should do in future episodes, please let me know in the comments. Thank you guys so much for watching. My name is Avery Peck, and I'll see you guys next time.